If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining. Today, our guest is Massella Dukuly. Massella is the head of workplace strategy and innovation at Charter, whose mission is to transform the workplace so workers can thrive. Massella has an MBA with a focus on leadership and organizational change. Her areas of expertise include talent development, employee engagement, optimizing CS team performance, and helping teams scale effectively. Massella has also trained more than 10,000 leaders at startups and global enterprises, including Squarespace and the New York Times. Massella, welcome to our show. I'm thrilled that you could join us today. And our topic of conversation is so relevant given all the issues that I think many companies are facing today. So thank you so much for joining. But before we jump in, would you mind sharing a little bit about what drives you in the work that you're doing, why you're so passionate about it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Arnette. Oh, there are so many reasons why I'm passionate, but I think very simply, when thinking about the world of work, I'm reminded by the fact that we will spend the majority of our life working. For the vast majority of us, it is a necessity. And beyond it being a necessity, I mean, especially I would say pre-pandemic, the people that you saw most often were your coworkers, sometimes more than people that you loved really deeply. And so if we are not active in rallying around creating workplaces that support not only our day-to-day because of survival and money and all those things, but that make us better people, that make us better in other relationships, that make our businesses better, then that is, I think, a true loss, not only for ourselves, but for future generations to come.
Yeah. I know in the area of expertise of managing change, you spent a good bit of effort on reduction in workforces and organizational change and reorganization. I don't know if you're a fan of Succession. I found myself watching this past episode. Did you see the last episode?
I'm saving it. I'm going to be watching it tonight. So don't spoil it fully.
Well, I won't spoil it too much for you. But this falls right into your field because there's a point where Tom and Greg are tasked with laying some folks off. Okay. And absolutely, the way they've orchestrated is the worst possible experience any employee could ever hope for. So it's going to resonate well with you. So that kind of brought it to mind as I'm sitting here, preparing for our conversation today. That struck me that was so timely. And I know so many companies probably just don't execute on that right. So what kind of recommendations can you give us about that very delicate topic right there?
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, first I'll just say I'm thinking about the whole Succession crew and worried. And, I think Succession sometimes seems like a parody of real life, but I think we all know some people who might be that way, or we know a situation that might mimic that. And so when thinking about layoffs, that's so much of what we do at Charter. Charter, my organization, we are a future of work media and research company, and we're focused on giving companies the playbook on how to do many things right, including layoffs. And so when I think about a very first step, I'll get mindful about not needing to reinvent the wheel. I think oftentimes what happens is there's a lot of nerves and energy around it feels uncomfortable. I think generally, even if it feels like a necessary thing to do, people are like, oh, I don't want to have to be the person. Maybe you're the person who has to deliver the news. Maybe you are the CEO who has to, tell everybody, of course, this is happening. Here's why it's happening. And sometimes that doesn't even go down effectively. But first and foremost, don't reinvent the wheel. Take a second and pause. There are many reasons why I think historically layoffs have gone down a certain way or another. So an example here might be recently we've seen a lot of organizations in the news who have been doing this new thing where they're like, we'll tell everybody, hey, in 3 or 6 months, you may be getting laid off. We're not sure yet. We'll figure out the numbers. And I know what it sounds like. I think what they think it sounds like is transparency. But in reality, you're keeping people in a state of anxiety for the next 3 to 6 months.
Right.
And even if they're not anxious about losing their job and they're thinking, well, I got to figure out what I need to do here to stay. So we're creating competitiveness that doesn't support collaboration, that kind of puts people in a position to throw others under the bus. The other thing that might be happening is that they just check out completely and they say, I'm just going to start looking for other jobs because there's no hope for me. So we really end up dwarfing productivity. And we've got to be thoughtful, like, is the thing I'm doing in the vein of kindness, or is it going to have some sort of blowback on how my team might show up, work? Again, transparency is important, but you really have to think about what the impact or the unintended consequence of those efforts might actually be.
Yeah. I know you recently issued an article in HR Brew about, offering some ideas on best practices for layoffs. Anything that you can provide us on that right now? Just a couple of topics that you addressed in that article?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I think for HR leaders in general, I would say you want to do this before a layoff happens in the first place, but more than anything, really try and build meaningful partnerships with your key stakeholders. So I'm talking your CEO, your CFO. CFO, of course, is going to be important because this is often what it comes down to when we are having a reduction force. Things aren't working out financially, generally. And I think it's important to really consider these relationships because layoffs are part of the employee cycle. It's not just the end of the journey. These might be people that you want to have come back. These might be people who, even if they don't ever come back, can say, hey, this is an amazing organization, and maybe that might be good for some other person that they know. And so working with your CFOs and your CEOs, whoever it might be, whatever stakeholders are going to be part of this decision-making process, is going to be integral to ensuring that the employee life cycle is not disturbed. You want to consider where you can be generous. So cost, I think sometimes people think, well, if I cut off 10 people from working here, that'll save us X amount of money. But keep in mind, losing people, even if very immediately, has its blowback, especially if they're talented people, right? So you might be losing institutional knowledge. You might be losing resources or time for other people to learn. And what we have to consider is knowing that I'm losing something anyway, what is the sunk cost here? Might I be able to be generous in this layoff process? Sometimes we truly just don't have any more money. And then I understand that. So it might even be something like, might I consider laying people off, the second day of the month rather than the end of the month so that they can get a full extra month of healthcare. People have families, people have bills to pay. That could be one thing. The other thing is really considering the unintended consequences of your comms messaging. Again, I think sometimes we go into it feeling like I have to remove all emotions from this. I have to just do what I need to do. And rightfully so, what will end up happening is you talk to anyone and they'll tell you if you're doing layoff conversations, some people will say, don't say sorry, avoid that altogether because you're just speaking the facts. But I think while I can understand, why that might not be appropriate in that larger individual conversation, what's dangerous about it is that we get so focused on the task that we don't consider how our words are actually landing with people. And if you're not thinking about how your comms are going to land and you need support with that, you need people giving you feedback and kind of working through it with you, know that comms might end up on the news or in some article. We've all seen them where you're like, I can't believe this person said this thing. But it's usually because they're nervous about how it's going to sound. They just bulldoze through it, not considering that they're dealing with people. And then it just ends up in the wrong way or coming across ineffectively.
Yeah. I know, unfortunately, I think many organizations today are finding themselves getting with small leadership teams, talking about potential layoffs and preparing for layoffs. What recommendations do you have for, a member of a team, maybe from HR, that sees leadership going off down a bad path? Have any suggestions on how they can, get this effort put back on a good track?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're really invested in at Charter, and we have what we call Charter Pro, and it's a year-long membership. Our goal, again, is to really sort of fast track the experience for people leaders to make it that they really sit as strategic leaders within their organization. And so one of the first things that we might even consider is how to build that true strategic partnership with your stakeholders. I think we have to remember as HR leaders that it's imperative that we are sort of showing and proving on a daily basis to our stakeholders that we are credible. It makes them more inclined to listen to us when there's a crisis happening, for example, a reduction in force or something else that might be going on. And so one of the first things that you might want to do is get very good at listening. People think that they're good at listening, but they're often not. And when you're listening, what you're listening for is what their stake is. You all definitely care about the same thing, which is the success of your organization. But what does it look like individually for these people? What does your CEO really care about? What does your CFO really care about? And managing these relationships helps you when you see things going off track. You can ground them in, hey, I know X, Y, and Z is very important to you. That's important to me too. And I am looking to make sure that we can set up our team or this initiative up for success by doing X, Y, and Z things that also link up to the thing that you see as the highest priority. But if you don't know what they care about, you haven't listened to it really well, or you're coming to them sort of grounded in emotion, which is often what we've seen, I'd say, historically from people leaders, is this sort of like, it's not right, here's the moral thing, but there's a lot of facts and research and data out there that you can really be using to drive that conversation. I will say, though, that first part about listening to their stake, making sure that they see you truly as a partner who has the capacity to see their point of view, is going to be fundamental, because sometimes you'll run into leaders who don't really care about facts. They just want to know that you have their back.
Yeah. Sometimes you can have the best process and plan laid out on terminations, but your messaging can be terrible.
Sure.
What recommendations do you have to maybe help get the best messaging you can on a initiative like this?
Yeah. So I think one of the first things, and this is something that we help a lot of our members really brainstorm and work out, because it needs to be authentic. Know that messaging in general needs to be authentic. It shouldn't sound like you copy and pasted it from some other leader or some other place. Truly speak to the needs of your organization and to the people there. But in that message, there should be some acknowledgement and accountability, period. I know that we can say, oh, it's the economy. And sure, there is truth to that. And sometimes we can't control every aspect of the economy. But what I can say is that we are responsible for being stewards of our organization as leaders. And we have to help our leaders, oftentimes your CEO or your COO, really help and say, hey, we had a different expectation. We thought it might go this way, and we maybe forecasted too liberally, or maybe we hired more aggressively than we should have. Could be anything. But people want to hear you say, I have a part in this. That doesn't mean that you're saying it's my fault, you single-handedly did it. But if you don't say that, you put people in the position to kind of feel like they have to come at you because you're not owning this misstep that, in reality, didn't have to happen in some cases.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is very important in messaging is your why. So why does this reduction in force feel necessary now? And what are the steps that you took to prevent it, if anything? Fine. Some people will say, well, we cut, budget in this area and we did this other thing. And ultimately, when we sat down and did the math, those things still weren't enough. And this is why this is happening. Here's how we plan to support you when you're offboarding. And the people that are often forgotten are the people who end up staying. How are we planning to make sure that their lives are not much harder because they've lost some percentage of their team members?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really critical because I know in the workplace, so many good friends are established just in the workplace, and
Yeah.
that can have some big impact. Now, I know you've previously stated that budgeting can be a very important component of layoff. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So look, as I was mentioning earlier, I think that sometimes people see layoffs that like what they can see when they're thinking about a reduction in force is that they've removed some line item or some number, some amount from their books. But I think the reality is like you have to think about the intangible costs as well. And so if you are letting people go in a way that is very dismissive of the time that they served at your organization, that shows that perhaps you don't care about them or, how they've worked, I think what can happen is like you're not considering the morale that you might lose. Like that's also a number, and maybe you don't see it on that again on the list of different values that come to your organization, but it is a factor. And all I'm saying is knowing that you're letting them go, knowing that there are already costs that are sunk. You want to consider what might I be able to offer to extend some generosity to these people. So again, maybe this is paying them for a week longer, extending severance, extending health insurance. It can be a number of different things, but I think the budgeting isn't just great, we're getting rid of people, because it's more than just people. Again, institutional knowledge, time, resources. Also know that often what we see after layoffs is that your employee base afterwards, the people who are left, are generally less productive, morale is low. And so I think what will help increase or help you avoid, mitigate that type of situation is when you find that people can trust that you've been as generous as you possibly could. And when you can't be generous, it's okay to explain, here's all that we can do and here's why.
Yeah. And you just touched on it, this concept referred to as layoff survivor guilt,
Yeah.
which, I think it's normal. It's a normal human response to seeing friends and colleagues let go. What recommendations can you provide teams to engage the workforce that remains and how to keep their spirits up and lifted?
Yeah. So as I was mentioning earlier, this is one of the things that so many of our members come to us, and I find that it's a neglected item. So I'm so glad that you're asking this, Arnette. People are so focused on what's the messaging going to be. We don't want to upset people. We don't want to get canceled. They worry so much about the people who are being laid off, and rightfully so. But the people who are forgotten, those people who might be suffering that survivor's guilt, they are a very big part of this too. And so one of the things that we'll advise our members to consider is having somebody else very much focused on that group solely. Things that you might try. One, after this is all said and done, like make sure you're giving people space to process. We have a tendency once the layoff is done, we're sort of like, okay, it's done. I know that was hard, but it's okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to move forward. And you're rushing people through the emotions of saying, that was hard. I don't like that. I don't like that I lost my counterpart. And as Arnette, you mentioned, I don't like that I lost a friend that I felt I could be comfortable with here or be myself with here at work. There are so many different factors, or even just the question, am I now going to have 2 times more work to do because I've lost 3 people on my team? And that is really stressful. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that your team is aware about how work is going to shift when people have now left the team. Is it now the responsibility that I'm picking up all their work, or are we deprioritizing something? That's going to be key. My advice would be to deprioritize some things, because running people dry when morale is low is not ideal. Yeah. Secondarily, I think you also want to, again, create some space for processing. I've seen companies do it in a few different ways. Sometimes they will offer, office hours for people to come and just share or ask questions, keeping in mind that beyond losing other team members, there's a fear like, is this going to happen again? Could I be next? That state of anxiety. Be clear about what you're trying to do to avoid layoffs from happening again, or if this was sort of a one-time deal. Do your best to create that space. And last but not least, again, rushing people through emotions, telling them It's going to be great. Don't worry about it. That's not what they need to hear. That acknowledgement is key. This is hard. We wish it didn't have to be this way. We're here to support you through the change. Know that this is an evolving situation. If you need support, here are the people that you can go to.
That's great. That's great. So, Massella, I think we find ourselves at the time where I asked this question to all my guests, which is, if S2 Verify were to conduct a background check on you today, would there be any surprises, any discoveries that we might be surprised with?
Well, I've been thinking about this question, and I don't know if this is quite surprising, but I think my work persona, or so much of what I do that's out in the world, is very work focused. But one thing I really do love is home. I really love gardening. I love cooking. I love interior design. And I think just like work, I think so much of who you are stems from that. Like, I like to imagine that, when you're having a wonderful day, it could be anything. You wake up, you're just in a great mood, like that starts home. When you hear amazing news, that starts home. And on the flip side, when you've had a bad day, this is where you rest your head. This is where you have a meal. This is where you create memories. And so I think it should be representative of you. And you'll find me doing a lot of things around my house, especially now that it's getting warm.
Well, that's great. So why don't you tell our audience where they can keep up with you and keep track of what's going on with you and Charter?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Massella Dukuly, and you can also find Charter on LinkedIn at CharterWorks. I will also say that you can go to charterworks.com/pro to learn about our membership offering and ways that we might be able to help you. I'll just emphasize that we have to really get it right. We are at a really amazing inflection point. We have 5 generations in the workplace right now. And so if we're not being mindful about ways to serve our employees, we are also neglecting serving our businesses, creating businesses that will last the test of time. When people feel like they're cared for, they show up, they do better work, they're innovative, they're thoughtful. And we want to help you figure out how to create a strategy to do that consistently instead of sort of having to chase the wheel when something bad happens.
That's great. Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Massella. It's just a wonderful conversation, so timely. And for our audience, please tune in next week when we do something a little different. Our marketing leader, Jenny Dietrich, will interview me about my career working in security and how HR pros can use some of the things I've learned over the years. We'll see you then. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do. Thanks so much, Massella.
Thanks, Arnette.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.